Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please drop us up, drop a like, and let us know your thoughts below in the comments. Also, please consider supporting our podcast via the link below. It really helps us out.
Chris, welcome to the World XP podcast. How are you doing? I feel like this has been a long time coming based on how many times we've played against each other, but here we are. We've made it happen.
I know, from the field to the podcast. I love it.
Yeah. So let's do a quick intro. Tell the people kind of who you are and what you do, and maybe we can go like a brief background of what we'll be talking about today. And then as the listeners know, and I told you about 3 minutes before we started, you'll get a question from the last guest, and then we'll hop right into it.
Sounds great. Yeah. So my name's Chris Barnard. I am half American, half Belgian. I was born in Belgium. My mom is from the US. My dad's from the Netherlands. They met in Belgium and stuck around and lived there for the first 17 years of my life. Kind of quite a political background. Like both parents are in journalism. My mom works for the European Parliament right now. And so kind of grew up with that background, was heavily involved. Like my first internship I ever did was at NATO. So that kind of gives you a sense of the background there. Also always played soccer or football, like the real people call it. I always really enjoyed that. It's obviously a huge European thing. And then ended up moving to the UK to play soccer. Played there for a few years, signed a contract with Dover Athletic, and was doing that full time for a while. And that was kind of a different stage of my life, but I really enjoyed it and got to like play against people like Phil Foden and Jadon Sancho and those guys, and it's just super crazy experience. And then when I was in the UK, I also ended up pursuing my studies. So got an undergrad in politics from the University of Kent, and then a master's from the London School of Economics, and was just deeply involved in politics. Then 2020 moved to DC to work for an organization that I now run called the American Conservation Coalition. We're the largest right of center environmental group in the US. Our view is that people across the aisle care about environmental issues, and for a long time, it was only one side of the aisle that was talking about it. But philosophically, like we were talking right before the show, like being a conservative is about conserving the things around you and passing that on to future generations, and the environment is a huge part of that. And so my day job is being president of ACC. We have over 50,000 volunteers across the country. We are on hundreds of college campuses. We have 30 staff, an office in DC. And so we're kind of heavily involved in politics on the right of center there. And then I play soccer for Alexandria on the side, and I'd like to see you guys and occasionally beat you and occasionally lose to you guys. But yeah, that's the background.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a lot to go off. I think this question actually fits then. The question is, what is your favorite way to connect with the communities that you are a part of? And for you, I think you're a part of quite a few, so you can go any which way with this answer. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm part of many different communities, like you said. Like I'm part of a soccer community that like meets on the field like multiple times a week, and then I'm part of like a political community, and then part of the church community, and part of like an international community with like my friends and family back in the UK, Belgium, the Netherlands. And really, to me, I feel like what helps me connect the most with those people is no matter what their background is, or no matter what their particular relationship to the community is, like who they are as a person. Like my faith is the most important part of my life, and being able to connect with people at that human level, no matter what the situation or context is, I think is just fundamental. And one of the things that we're not doing in society nowadays, right? Like we ascribe labels to people. It's like, oh, you're Republican, you're a Democrat, you're from this country, you're from that country, you're on this soccer team, you're on that soccer team, right? Like we ascribe labels to that rather than distill to like, what is your true identity? Who are you as a child of God? And how can you connect based on that? I think that's one of the things that I connect with people best on is when you're having conversations at that level rather than the superficial things that people too often like to focus on nowadays.
Yeah, I want go on that a little bit more because obviously your job is very, I don't know if tribal is not the right word, but it's the word that gets thrown around a lot nowadays. But your job is being part of a team and pushing kind of a particular agenda um w to other people. And so a lot of people I think are kind of in this, I don't know if they're in like a trance state or whatever, but as soon as they hear a certain buzzword, and this happens with anyone on either side, they'll hear a certain buzzword and immediately just shut off. And it doesn't matter what words you're saying after that. What's next is those talking points or those responses for that whatever the subject or issue is. So how do you break that barrier and go about making those connections? Especially or maybe a better way to phrase it is, how do you balance still wanting to push, you're fighting for these ideas and these particular issues, but at the end of the day, you still have to reach across and do it in a way without coming off as like, oh, I'm only trying to convince you, rather than, but you're also trying to make a connection, and that generally is the best way to convince somebody, is you make a connection with them first, and then you talk to them and you understand where they're coming from. So how do you like balance all that? Because not that it's a contradiction, but there's a lot of things going on with, yes, we have to do this, but also I need to make a connection with this person who hates what I have to say.
Right.
So how do you kind of handle that?
Yeah, there's definitely a tension, right? There's no denying that. And I think there's really two different aspects of the way that you approach that. And I'll talk about both, but the first thing to acknowledge, I think, which is interesting, is like, yes, I run a conservative organization. I'm involved in Republican politics. I'm on the youth advisory council for the Republican Party. Like that, I don't hide that. Like that's a part of who I am. But also by virtue of the issue that we work on, which are conservation and environmental issues, actually that opens up a door with people on the other side of the aisle who disagree with us politically, but have that same care and concern for the issue. Because the reality is most people talking about environmental issues are left leaning, right? And so there is that interesting opening, but yes, on the right, but also the issue that I focus on is primarily dominated by people on the left. And so that forces that conversation to happen. And really honestly, like a lot of my job is talking to people on the other side and trying to find common ground. And if you want to get anything done in this country, the way you do that is by getting bipartisan buy-in, right? Like you have to stand strong for your ideas and your principles. And like what they say is like you compromise not on principle, but on policy. And you try and find like the art of the possible in politics. And like an example of that was earlier this year, we did a roundtable with Arnold Schwarzenegger at his office in LA, and we had 10 of the kind of top environmental activists, youth environmental activists from across the country sitting at that table. And obviously, like most of those were people on the left. And we were there for a day with Arnold Schwarzenegger, just having conversations about how can we build a movement that actually brings people together rather than divides them? How can we pursue policy solutions that are actually good for both the environment and for the American people and the people in the world, rather than kind of pit humans against nature. And so a lot of that is trying to like find that common ground. So that's really, I think, the first part of that, right? Trying to find that common ground and establish that. The second part, though, is that you also need to sometimes stand up for your principles, and you need to sometimes speak hard truths, and you need to speak them in love, but you shouldn't be afraid of saying those. And I've done that a lot as well. Like, for example, if you're against nuclear plants, or if you're shutting down nuclear plants, I will call you out and say you're probably not a serious or a very good actor when it comes to like climate change or environmental issues. If you're out there blocking traffic or throwing soup at paintings or making people's lives miserable, you're probably more performative than you are constructive in this conversation, and you deserve to be called out. And so, yeah, to some extent, it is calling out the bad ideas that we see from certain corners. But then, to the extent that people are willing to have a conversation about solutions that we can agree on, always willing to have that conversation. And so, yeah, there is that natural tension. But if you go, you don't go for the jugular at the personal level, you go for it at the ideas level. Then you can have that personal relationship and still have the conversations, even if you disagree vehemently on something.
Yeah, completely makes sense. Can you describe for the people listening, the soup on the paintings thing? Because
Yeah.
I remember the story, but that's almost not that it's the same as Trump saying they're eating the pets and nobody knows what he's talking about, but just for the
Right,
people
right,
listening,
right.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so most people will know that there's a lot of people, especially young people, who really care about climate change and the environment. And you have climate activist groups who resort to fairly extremist stunts to draw attention to what they like called the climate crisis. Some of those stunts involve like them blocking traffic with signs saying like the climate crisis is upon us, like the fossil fuel companies are evil or whatever it is that they have on the signs. Sometimes like they did a stunt where they went to a museum and they threw Heinz tomato soup on a Van Gogh painting, because they knew that everyone would cover it in the news, and then people would be like, it would be drawing attention to that. What they don't realize is that by doing something like that, most people look at you and think you're completely insane. Like there's not a single person, and the polling shows this, and the research shows this. There's like very, very few people that look at that and say, "Oh yeah, now all of a sudden I'm super concerned and want to be involved in whatever they're pushing for." Like they rightfully see these people as crazy, and I think the conversation around environmental issues has kind of been polarized on those extremes, right? You get people saying the world's going to end in 10 years and they're throwing stupid paintings, and then other people saying that like there's no problem whatsoever, and we should just ignore this and it's all crazy. It's like, well, actually, the truth is kind of in the middle. Like, yes, we should be concerned, but it's not the end of the world, and let's come up with solutions like nuclear energy that make sense rather than just do performative stunts that don't convince anyone.
Yeah. How should people sift through the things that are being displayed in the media or from politicians, right? We've seen in California, um, they tried to push a initiative where they wouldn't sell gas fueled cars by 2035, I think it was, or 2030 or something like that. And then that summer they're like, oh, also, by the way, don't charge your Teslas because we don't have the infrastructure for it. And you're like, that doesn't really make sense. And then, like you said, other people will say like, "Oh, well, climate change is a hoax, or maybe we don't really know what's going on," which might be true. And then on the same token, I think there was last summer. Um, oh, I don't remember. There was like a heat wave, and somebody was like, "Oh, it's because of climate change," and it's like, well, that might be true, but also it might not be. And so putting this fear into people that because there was a big hurricane, that it's because of this thing. So how should people sift through like what's going on and kind of look at like what's the lens that they should look at these things by when they see a headline or an article or somebody on TV saying whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, I'm not gonna lie, right? Like there's so much information floating around. Like you can Google anything to find to like back up your point of view. And you can go social media or go to the media and see anything that like says this or that, and often they're contradictory positions. This sounds kind of like self-centered, but I feel like people should check out our website, and I feel like we try to give a fairly rational, sober-minded view of these issues, and we have like policy positions. We have an online academy with courses on this. Like just to give like a 1 minute kind of debrief on climate science. The international body called the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a UN body that does all the researching and like gathers the top scientists from around the world to like do the research on climate change and push it out these papers. They publish a range of scenarios, right? Because in good science, you publish all of your potential findings with like the hypotheses. And so they have multiple scenarios ranging from like nothing's going to happen to the world's going to be on fire. And when they publish that, the media and climate groups and people like that will gravitate towards the most extreme scenario and be like, oh my gosh, like the world is on fire. And they present that as like, oh, look, scientists are saying this. Whereas actually in the same papers, the scientists are saying that they have the lowest confidence that the most extreme scenario is going to be the actual scenario that happens. But at the same time, the scientists also say they have low confidence that the nothing is going to happen scenario is the right scenario. So what they're basically telling us is like both extremes are, according to their scientific interpretation of the data, the least likely to happen, and it'll probably be somewhere in the middle. And there can be debates about that, right? It might be like a few degrees of warming here, it might be a little less than that. It might be this impact or that impact. And you have that scientific information, and from there you have to make policy. And just because scientists kind of give you a range of scenarios doesn't mean that gives you all the policy prescriptions. Then it's up to people to actually come up with like, okay, maybe we should use more nuclear, or maybe shutting down fossil fuels overnight and causing like poverty and misery for people is not like, it makes the solution worse than the problem, right? And so it is difficult to parse through that. I would say like we're honestly like a pretty sober-minded, rational approach to these issues for people that want to learn more and kind of sift through that. Also on my social media, on our organizational social media, we talk a lot about these things. So like with the hurricane that you like referenced, climate change, like the data clearly says climate change does not cause more hurricanes. What it does do, the data suggests that it makes current hurricanes more intense. So like there's a study that a rapid attribution study after the hurricane that found that it's likely that climate change increased rainfall during this hurricane by 50%, right? Like that's not nothing either. But people going around saying like, oh my gosh, there's going to be dozens more hurricanes because of climate change. Like, no, the data doesn't say that. But the data also doesn't say that there's nothing to do with it. It's somewhere in the middle. And same like with the point, like I think it was like this, the study was in Phoenix that you were referencing, where Phoenix was like increasing in temperature every year, and some climate activists said, "Oh, if you take that trend forward, Phoenix will be like 250 degrees in 10 years." And we're like, that's obviously stupid and obviously not like a correct representation of the data. But it's frustrating because the reality is that Phoenix is getting hotter, and that is causing certain problems. And if you live in the city and like Phoenix is struggling with water availability because it's in the desert. Like it's extremely hot, and people have like sky high AC bills. There are simple policy solutions that you could actually implement that make economic sense and solve the problem as well. But people fear mongering and saying Phoenix will be 250 degrees in 10 years, like that's ridiculous and kind of makes the conversation more polarized.
Yeah, I want to run the AC bill thing that you mentioned was actually a very good segue into the energy portion, because you mentioned nuclear as well. Um, Vivek, who we were speaking about before we started, is adamant, and I think, well, not that I would know, that fossil fuels are necessary, at least for the time being. I would tend to agree with that. I would also throw out there that battery technology seems to be the kind of the limiting factor for renewables, especially at the moment. Whatever the mineral is, right? Lithium and cobalt and some of the other things that we need for these batteries. One, they're super hard to get to, and often not by the most ethical methods, let's say. And two, the storage of energy isn't something that we seem to have cracked yet. And so we're in a situation where, and tell me if I'm off base, but this is just my kind of conclusions after following a bunch of anecdotes. Basically, seems like for whatever reason, people don't, people being the powers that be, don't want to go nuclear. Nuclear power plants are getting shut down. Fossil fuels are still important and getting fought over, right? You've got natural gas as a in the regions of Ukraine that are currently being fought over. Um, and solar is not doesn't the sun is not shining all the time, nor is the wind blowing all the time, and we don't have the battery capabilities to store when it's super windy or whatever to keep it there. And so we're in the situation where we're kind of stuck. Is that a fair assessment? Like, what's the next steps for like, it seems everyone I've talked to thus far has been like, no more nuclear is the answer. Why? What's the holdup with that, I guess?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. So trying to like take in different
Yeah,
portions.
yeah, yeah.
Know if
It's
I
just
forget.
thoughts, and we'll just have a
Yeah.
conversation and
Yeah.
go
Let
off
me
of
know
them.
if
Yeah,
I
yeah.
forget anything or whatever. But um, I actually just published an essay for National Affairs talking about kind of how we can reorient towards a new energy security paradigm. And one of the problems, like you referenced, for example, Europe and what's happening with Ukraine and Russia, one of the problems that we've had over the last like decade or two is energy tended to be quite abundant and reliable. And all of a sudden, people start caring about like environmental sustainability, clean energy, climate change. And so politicians start thinking about energy in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of it being clean. And they started to kind of forget the affordability and reliability aspects of energy. But really, when you're talking about trying to have like an energy grid, there's what they call the energy trilemma. It's you want affordable energy, you want reliable energy, but you also want sustainable energy. And sustainable doesn't just mean like no emissions or minimal pollution or whatever. It also means like continuously available, right? So like fossil fuels are a finite source. Like once you burn a lump of coal, that lump of coal is gone. And so you might be able to dig up more, but at some point there might be a natural end to it. And so those three aspects of energy, all three need to be balanced. You can't just have sustainability over reliability and affordability. That's essentially what Germany did. They shut down their nuclear plants, they shut down their natural gas facilities, and so they thought they could just do all of this on wind and solar. Turns out wind and solar only have a capacity factor, meaning they produce electricity only 30% of the time because the wind doesn't blow 24/7 and the sun doesn't shine 24/7. And like you said, batteries aren't ready yet. And so all of a sudden they found themselves struggling to make electricity ends meet, and were importing a bunch of natural gas from Russia. Then Russia invades Ukraine, and they realize, oh crap, we're subsidizing the invasion of Ukraine and subsidizing Putin's coffers because we aren't producing that energy ourselves. But the irony is that they were importing fossil fuels from Russia rather than producing their own nuclear or their own natural gas. And so that's just an example of prioritizing their vision of sustainability over actual reliability and affordability. My argument is similar to like what you were saying, is like we need all sources of energy because the world is growing. One of the most important things for an economy to grow is to have affordable, reliable energy. With the AI boom and data centers popping up left, right, and center, you're going to need more and more and more energy that's only going one direction. And the reality is that fossil fuels are going to play an important part of that for a fairly foreseeable future. Nuclear plays an important part of that, right? Like nuclear provides 20% of the electricity in the United States, but we've been shutting down nuclear plants rather than opening new ones. We've opened 2 new ones in the last year, thankfully, but other than that, we've shut dozens down over the last few decades. And the reality is that actually nuclear is the only clean source of energy that is also what they call baseload. So it provides electricity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it's also incredibly safe. It's actually the safest source of energy. When you look at the statistics, you're more likely to die falling off of your roof installing solar panels than you are from a nuclear facility. People talk a lot about Fukushima and the accident in Japan or 3 Mile Island in the US. No one died from either of those. There was deaths from the tsunami in Japan, but no one actually died from the nuclear reactor meltdown. And so yeah, it's kind of weird that we're in a world where people want clean energy, but you have climate activists shutting down nuclear plants. I think part of that is the remnant of like a Cold War view of this. It's like, oh no, nuclear power means nuclear war and proliferation, then nuclear waste is going to destroy the planet and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of like a Simpsons-esque view of nuclear as like green sludge, like going into the environment, which is just not true. And so a lot of what we talk about is, look, if you actually want to have a energy future that's reliable, affordable, and sustainable, nuclear has to be at the center of that. But also in the meantime, like American natural gas is A, cleaner than coal, and B, more cleanly produced in America than almost anywhere else in the world. So if we want to have increasingly clean energy, let's produce it here at home and send it abroad. A lot of the world still relies on like coal or dung or wood or biomass to power themselves. If we can produce an American natural gas and then export it as liquefied natural gas or LNG, that would actually be good from an environmental perspective because you're minimizing their reliance on things like coal. And like when Biden announced the LNG export ban, like earlier this year or last year, I forget when exactly it was. I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal saying like this doesn't even make sense from an environmental perspective because just because you take away supply doesn't mean demand goes away, and that demand will be met somehow. And if we're not the ones doing it, it's going to be Venezuela or Iran or Russia or coal or China or any of those other kind of dirtier sources. And so the whole argument from the kind of climate movement on these issues falls apart under the weight of reality, under the weight of their own contradictions. So kind of a long monologue on that. I do want to quickly mention the battery thing because you brought that up.
Yeah.
It's true. Batteries are the limiting factor for renewables. However, I was actually having dinner with the CEO of a company called Form Energy, and they have just come up with a new type of battery, which is an iron battery. So not lithium, but iron. And
Interesting.
their claim is that they can bring the costs down by 10x. So it could be literally 10% of the cost of a lithium battery, and you could like have these like huge batteries that just power like days or weeks, or hopefully at some point even months of energy in the battery. And iron is much more readily available in nature than something like lithium. Like you said, it's very difficult to mine lithium, and we get most of it from China. But we can get iron very easily here. And so there's innovation happening all the time. And so my view is we should not be precluding that. We should actually be incentivizing that and investing in that. And I trust America to come up with the best innovations in the world to do that. But we can't prematurely shut down nuclear or prematurely shut down LNG or natural gas or oil if the technology is simply not there yet. And so we need to keep that reliable energy going while at the same time investing in new innovation that can help us be better on that sustainability front as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would Actually, afterwards, we'll talk about the iron thing because we don't need to kind of go deep down the weeds on that one. I just would like to learn more at some point. But um, I want to touch on. Okay, so you mentioned earlier that you sit on the advisory, young advisory for the RNC. Is that the correct? Yeah. So when you're sitting in these rooms and people are talking about energy and all these things, right? Because I'm sitting here I try to pay attention, but it is not what I do for a living, as it is you. And some of the things, like we just mentioned, it's like this seems fairly evident that more nuclear is the way to go, and and the other things that you mentioned, like they seem fairly evident to somebody who's not even in that world all the time. When you're in those rooms and trying to say, hey, we're gonna, like you mentioned, you wrote an article or whatever, and you're advising people on policy and things like that, what is there pushback, or like I guess what I'm getting at is it seems fairly clear. The data seems fairly clear from the stuff that I've read and the people that I've talked to. Not that I'm some all authoritative source on it, but I've not really heard anyone recently say like, no, nuclear is bad. Even from the left sort of side of things, they're talking about clean energy and stuff. But also, most of the I'll say like dirty energy is not even produced by the West, anyways. So is more produced by India, China, and things like that. So what, like when you're sitting in these rooms and you're like, hey, I think we should do nuclear, are people saying no, or like where's the stop from? Because everyone seems to agree, and then it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. The reality is when you are in a room behind closed doors, most people are, yeah, absolutely. We're on board with this. We need more nuclear. Like a lot of people even recognize that we need to still have fossil fuels. And like basically based on the arguments of everything I just mentioned, I think the problem that you run into in the environmental and climate space is how much the politics is captured by big green interest groups. I'm not going to name, well, I'll name a few names. So like for example, like the Sierra Club was one of the original groups that was like helping shut down nuclear plants. And like when like right now there's some plans for new plants to be opened in I think Iowa and then another in Illinois, I believe, or Michigan. And the local Sierra Club chapters are like lobbying and advocating against that.
So why though, I guess is what I'm getting at. Like I understand that there's groups that are saying like, oh, they'll melt down and there'll be nuclear explosions and all these things. And obviously nuclear war is bad. Like if anyone needs to go argue that, then that's a different issue. But like what's the incentive for that, right? You mentioned at the top of the show, if somebody's against nuclear, then they're not being serious as a climate advocate, or I don't remember exactly what word you used, but they're not being serious as a person who's advocating to save the environment, et cetera, et cetera. What's the incentive? That's the thing. That's the thing that I don't understand. Like, there's an optics piece maybe, but like, that's the part that I don't get.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some people that do have that kind of Cold War hangover of like, oh, this is actually dangerous and we shouldn't let this happen. And so there's some of that. I think some other is also like I've seen people literally seen people make this argument where using nuclear is like does not dismantle the system of oppression of capitalism and the way that our current economic system works. And nuclear is almost like too easy of a solution because uh you can't overhaul the rest of society for that. And proposals like the Green New Deal, which are 100% renewables, exclude nuclear very explicitly. The authors of that actually said it was never really a climate thing at all. Like if you read the Green New Deal, it's only 14 pages, so if you have some time, you should read it. It's like actually a lot of it's about racial justice, about universal health care, about universal housing, like a jobs guarantee, like things like that. And like the climate stuff is kind of the vehicle in which they package all of these other progressive priorities. But the problem is that nuclear is almost a solution that is too elegant, too easy, where you can't smuggle all of these other things into it. So that's one other argument. Some say that nuclear is too expensive. I think that's probably the fairest argument to make. It is expensive to build nuclear plants. We can have a whole conversation about why it's expensive. Part of it is because those groups have lobbied for regulations that don't make sense. And so it's very, very difficult to build a new nuclear plant in the United States. But there's other issues with that as well. So I think the economic piece is definitely one where we can have a conversation. But a lot of the other stuff really just doesn't make sense. And there's actually, like, I don't know if you saw the news about 3 Mile Island, but Microsoft struck a deal with Constellation. Constellation is, I believe, the largest nuclear operator in the US, to reopen the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant that got shut down, to power a Microsoft AI data center, which is actually really actually kind of exciting news, right? Because we're seeing like even big tech companies embrace nuclear because
Yeah.
they want to power these AI data centers. They want to do it in a clean way. So nuclear is the obvious answer to that. But Jane Fonda, like the big environmental activist Jane Fonda, writes an op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer earlier this week saying how there's not enough room in the climate space for both nuclear and renewables, and why this is actually a bad idea. And so you're kind of contending with some crazy ideas like that.
That's uh so two things. Well, maybe it's more than two, but initially, first thoughts on that are Microsoft being able to get their own nuclear power plant um is good that big companies are wanting to do that. But it's interesting that did the deal go through? Is it like for sure going to happen?
Yeah.
So it's interesting, right? You mentioned all these regulations and then all of a sudden Microsoft comes along and they're like, yeah, well, we're kind of big and we got some money, so we'll just go ahead and do that. And that strikes me as an interesting phenomenon, something to think about for sure as I fit it into my like big picture thing of how things are going on. That's super interesting. I don't really know what to think about that, and I don't remember what the other thing I was going to say. Oh, AI. I had a data guy on, AI data guy on, and he's like, yes, but between that and crypto, the amount of energy that is going to be needed for that is going to 5, 10, 20x in whatever time frame. And again, using the California Tesla example, there's no infrastructure for that. And we're going to end up like the supply demand issue I see as a big problem and maybe a contributing factor to the situation that we are currently in Ukraine. And that doesn't strike like all of these things seem to just contradict themselves. And so I will go back to the behind closed doors thing. And when you're advising people, like these things seem to just contradict themselves all over the place. And it's like I don't understand it. I don't know. I'm really at a loss because it's like we want more energy. We want it to be clean, but it shouldn't be nuclear because we're scared. But then it has to be all renewable, but also we're in a uh, proxy war where maybe part of it is because there's natural gas, which isn't like it's just like all of it just like they're like, oh, government's
Or
like, oh yeah.
we can't mine the minerals in America to be able to actually build some of the renewables.
Right.
Uh,
It just
Make it
none of it
possible.
makes sense. Like it just makes my head want to explode. And I
Yeah.
don't like that was also one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you because you're in the space and other people that I talk to who are not in the space, we get to this point and we're both just like, "Oh, yeah, I don't know." And then we just agree to move on to a different subject. So, like I don't like what are you seeing? Is the tide turning at all, do you think? Is nuclear becoming more of a viable option politically? Is like are you seeing is there progress being made from a standpoint of more people are like, oh yeah, this group makes no sense, and maybe some of the regulations will get peeled back, or like what do you like what are your
Yeah.
thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a shift happening. Uh, I about a year and a half ago, or actually about 2 years ago, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal called the Global Nuclear Power Comeback," and that was because California had just decided to save its last nuclear plant. It was set to close, and then they extended the life cycle of the plant. And it was actually Dianne Feinstein, the senator from the Democratic senator from California, who had been a nuclear critic before, who had urged the governor to keep it open because of all the factors that we just said. And so I wrote this article kind of showing how actually across the world that's kind of happening. Like Japan is looking to reopen nuclear. South Korea is looking to expand nuclear. In Europe, they want to have more nuclear. I think Germany's kind of the outlier where they've actually shut down all their plants now. But for the most part, countries are realizing that, wow, like we were kind of dumb to not embrace this or to like actually actively oppose it. In terms of public opinion, the pro-nuclear opinion is about 56%, so like 55 to 60%, which is the majority of people in favor of new nuclear, which is the highest that we've seen in America in decades. That's really exciting. I think people are starting to get tired of the performative activism of climate activists on this stuff. Like again, if you see videos of like soup being thrown at paintings or traffic being blocked, you're like, I'm sick and tired of this. If you to your point, like you hear we want clean energy, we want to have no emissions. Be like, oh, here's nuclear, this great opportunity to do that. And they're like, no, we don't want that. It's like it doesn't make sense to normal people. And so you do have a little bit of shifting of the tide on that. And then now, like you said, with the AI stuff and crypto and everything, like we just need so much more energy and so much more electricity that you have big tech companies and companies like Amazon and others that are like, yeah, we just can't do it without nuclear, which is why you see like 3 Mile Island reopening. Last week, I had the chance to ask the CEO of NVIDIA kind of his thoughts on this, and there's a clip of it, and he said, yeah, it's nuclear is vital. We can't do without nuclear. And so you do have that narrative shift that's happening. The biggest problem, honestly, that we're facing right now is the policy and the regulation. And that's kind of the nature of our government, right? Things move slow and you have bureaucratic inertia, and the status quo is always easier to defend than doing bold, big, ambitious things. And we need a bold, big, ambitious plan to build new nuclear in America. We need to reform the regulations. We need to send a signal that nuclear is here to stay. And that's more a policy question now than it really is a public opinion question. You'll have the cranks on the left, you'll have the Jane Fondas of the world, and to be clear, like they're still powerful with like their part of the world. But I do think that things are headed the right direction.
Speaking of the regulation piece, I think Trump, when he went in the first time, rolled back a bunch of regulation from EPA and a few other agencies and departments and things of that nature. Does it seem with the new coalition, let's say, with the RFK and Tulsi and Vivek, it's kind of this is not your traditional sort of Republican grouping or ticket. Does it seem to be that there is or at least the coming together of a cohesive sort of, we need to roll back these 3 regulations? It's not the number 3, but you know what I mean. We need to roll back these 3 things, and this agency needs this part of it to not be effective anymore, and we need to do this, and this. Does that seem to be coming along? Or like when you speak to these people like NVIDIA and these other people that are like, yeah, we need nuclear, right? You're going to end up with big companies lobbying for nuclear, which I think would affect the way that government does things. So has it been, and if this is me just re-asking or restating a thing that we said earlier, you can also say, yeah, we already talked about that. And yes, the answer is yes. But like, have you seen anything on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because political reality doesn't necessarily always match policy reality. And the problem with this issue is that nuclear regulation, which is run through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the federal body in charge of regulating nuclear, is so extremely in the weeds and complex. And you have differing, like pro-nuclear people can have differing perspectives on what needs to be reformed, right? Like I know people that are like, we need to abolish the NRC and have every state just regulate nuclear themselves. Other people are like, NRC can exist, but we should just allow people to go into the desert, and as long as they can prove they're not killing anyone, they can just do whatever they want in the desert with like innovations and small modular reactors and that kind of stuff. Kind of like the Manhattan Project, right?
Yeah.
Other people are like, well, we just need to reform the way that the NRC's mission essentially right now is to protect the public from nuclear almost more than it is to promote nuclear. And so as a result, you almost have you have the wrong incentives within the bureaucracy where they're so afraid of anything potentially going wrong rather than like trying to come up with a way to actually effectively build new nuclear. And so you have these ridiculous standards around radiation and how much radiation is allowed. Most people don't know that, like, if you eat a banana or you fly or you live in Denver near the mountains, you're exposed to more radiation than you would be at if you're working at a nuclear plant. But they have like these absurd standards around how much radiation is acceptable. And so that makes it extremely difficult for plants that are trying to build a reactor to actually stand like be like compliant with those standards. Um, up until very recently, we didn't even have a separate regulatory track for fusion, which is nuclear, but a different type of nuclear. We still don't have really a separate regulatory track for next generation small modular reactors. And so we're forcing these smaller, different types of technologies that are still nuclear but smaller to go through the same regulatory pathway as the big ones, which doesn't make any sense. And so there's a million different ways, as you can tell, like from how I'm explaining this, that like it's super complex, it's super in the weeds. Like a politician can be out there saying like, I'm so pro nuclear, let's build more, and have no clue how exactly we should go about it, because that's the unsexy part of policy making, that needs to get figured out. And honestly, like, again, bureaucratic inertia sometimes takes over. And I hope that people will kind of keep pushing in the right direction, but that's really kind of where that political rally doesn't always match up with that policy reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I know it's tough, right? And there's no easy kind of solutions to these things with government and all the different people and regulations and bylaws and guidelines and things that are on the books. There's never a simple answer really for any of that stuff. I want to zoom out a little bit and ask a couple. So one, how did you end up, I'll say, like, how did you end up in a position where you're meeting all these people, you're writing articles for the Wall Street Journal, you're meeting CEOs of these giant companies? Like, how did you end up in that position? And the first time that you were in, like, meeting somebody, you're like, oh, that person's a big deal, for lack of a better term. Like, was it nerve-wracking for you, or were you in there with somebody else? Like, how did that process just happen for you? Because it seemed like a very quick rise. You come over here, and then 4 years later, you're president of the organization, and you're doing interviews with Vivek and meeting the CEO of NVIDIA, who maybe is best friends with Nancy Pelosi. I didn't say that out loud. Anyways,
Yeah.
anyways,
Well, I mean, I do feel like a big part of like, at least like I mentioned, I'm a Christian, and I feel like there's a big part of like God has a plan for people, and the closer you try to align with that, the more those kinds of opportunities open up. And so I would be remiss if I didn't like mention that I think that's a big part of it. So that's like up to the big man upstairs part of it, and obviously I need to like do my part with that as well. And honestly, the attitude I've always taken is, if you know who you are and you have a clear vision of what you want to achieve, you have every right to express that, and you have the right to people at least taking you seriously in that. And I think a lot of people, especially younger people, will be like, well, I'm only like 22 or 23, and why would this CEO want to talk to me? Or why would this member of Congress or Vivek Ramaswamy or whatever be interested in talking to me? It's like, no, you have to take an attitude of kind of being willing to demand someone's time because you have something to offer and you have a clear vision of who you are and where you want to go. And you're offering for them to be a part of that in that conversation or in that partnership or that collaboration. And selling yourself short and not taking that approach, I think, is the worst possible thing anyone can do, if you're kind of inclined towards wanting to engage in those entrepreneurial ways. So I'd say that's one. Another thing is saying, like, being a yes man when it comes to opportunities. I think a lot of people will be like, oh, like, I don't want to travel across the country to do this event, or why would I like spend time like putting in the extra hour for this, or why would I take this meeting or whatever. And like, some of our biggest donors came like super accidentally, where I was like, don't really want to do this, but I probably should, and I go, and it's like the middle of nowhere, Oklahoma City. I'm like, oh, actually, now this person's giving us a lot of money, and that was totally worth it. And I think people can take themselves too seriously and be like, I shouldn't do this, I just have to make someone else do it or whatever. But if you say yes to opportunities, more opportunities will come. And I'm just reading a book right now by a friend of mine wrote a book about Teddy Roosevelt, who my favorite president. And if people don't know much about him, you absolutely should. He's like one of the most amazing people who ever lived. And what the most amazing thing about Teddy Roosevelt was that he performed every job he had as if it were his last job. He put his entire heart and soul into everything he did to make sure that he left a legacy, and he left no stone unturned, and he was committed and put in the work and put in the hours and the blood, sweat, and tears, and the results come from that. And so that's kind of the vision and the philosophy I apply every day. And so I think that's a huge part of it. And then the third thing I would say is dreaming. Like, people kind of like the cliche, like dream big, like change the world, like be the change you want to see. Like, there's a little bit of like a cliche, right? But there's also a really big element of that that's true, insofar as if you have a good idea, why would you assume that someone else is going to do that? Why would you assume that someone else has already had that idea or whatnot? Um, Obviously, if you have an idea, you need to stress test it against other people's ideas or reality, or do a search if anyone else has done that before. But are like the things that we've done were crazy ideas that we came up with like on a whiteboard, and everyone was like, "Nah, there's no way you can do that," and then we did it, and they actually turned out to work out kind of great. Like, for example, when I was like, okay, we're in a presidential year. There's a Republican primary. There's a bunch of these different candidates. It'd be kind of cool to go talk to them and see what they think about these issues. Let's do a candidate series. So we partnered with some groups up in New Hampshire and did like presidential events with Vivek Ramaswamy and the Nikki Haley campaign and Doug Burgum and the governor of New Hampshire, Chris Sununu, and they said yes, and they showed up and we talked to them. It's like the only way that ever happened was because we came up with the idea and we asked them, and the worst they can say is no. And so I think that attitude of not precluding yourself based on your own fears or your own doubts or your uncertainty, but just being like, yeah, whatever, screw it, we'll try and see what comes of it, and be humble throughout it. I think that's kind of the best advice that I've ever gotten, and the best advice I can pass on.
Yeah. The thing you said about always saying yes, I don't remember if it was Tammy Brailsford or Melanie Cumbie, but they're both kind of, one was a chief operating officer at some giant hospital system out in Southern California, and the other was like an HR executive. And I can't remember which one, because one introduced me to the other one, but one of them said exactly the same thing, like always say yes to to opportunities, and more will come. And then the thing that you said last is like the worst that they can do is say no if you ask. It's like, yeah, 100% true. I think um a lot of people kind of have the, oh, I have a good idea, but somebody else said it was stupid, so I won't pursue it. It's like, and that's tough to get through, especially like growing up in school and dealing with, well, the phenomenon of growing up and finding out who you are as a person. That's tough. It's tough to go through. Was that developed for you? Like for me, I had to develop that a lot, the saying yes thing, and the worst that they can do is say no. Like there was a lot of like development, self-development in that. Like that took a while for me to kind of get used to having that mindset. Was it the same for you as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a myth that someone's born a CEO or born like no, like everyone has to get there, and you have to train yourself and be disciplined and invest in yourself, and do the little things along the way that over time add up. And so yeah, I mean, like obviously people have character traits, and like one of my character traits is that I like to like dream big and pursue big, and I have like natural leadership tendencies, and so obviously that helps, but that doesn't mean that I was born on a stage with Vivek Ramaswamy talking to him. Like, I still had to get there, and that came through hard work and through investment. And like one of the things, like one of the rules that I set for myself, one was say yes to opportunities. The other was when you're in a room and you have an opportunity to speak. So like if that's at an event and they ask any questions, be the first to put your hand up. If that's you're in a group and they like ask any thoughts or any suggestions, be the first to speak up, or at least don't leave that room until you've said your piece. And that kind of like rule for life has really helped me a lot. So like the thing with NVIDIA, we were like at this small event, and they're like, okay, any questions for the CEO of NVIDIA? And I was like, yeah, I have a question. And so I'd like ask my question, and then we got him on the record talking about nuclear, and like all these little things matter and have ramifications, and it builds up your muscle of being willing to stand up on a stage and ask the question, or share your piece. And like, again, do it in a humble way. You don't have to like be arrogant. Like sometimes you don't know what you don't know, and people might be smarter or have more wisdom or more experience, but that doesn't mean you can't speak either. And so I think a lot of it really is uh, building yourself up in those little ways so that it becomes natural over time. So that now when I'm like meeting a senator, I'm like, hey, yeah, this is what I do. Here's where I think we could help. Let's do it. And like some of that has to be audacious, right? Like you have to be willing to be the guy that like gets a number from the sender and texts him, and then like you talk about a project you can do together, or like get the CEO to do an event. Like we last week in New York City, we launched our New York City chapter, and um, I was so the CEO of General Electric Vernova, they supply 25% of the world's electricity. Um, we got him to do a fireside chat with me on the stage in front of 75 people. And I was like, just ask. This is like the guy of literally the largest energy like provider in the world. Said yeah, and he spent an hour with us talking about this stuff. Just ask. Like get his number afterwards, text him and keep in touch. Like those are the kinds of things that people can be like a little intimidated by. And I was at 1.2, but now it's like they're also humans, and if you're interesting and genuine, you're going to have something to offer to them, because they see you as an interesting, genuine person. And I think taking that attitude is just crucial to this kind of stuff.
Yeah. It The other thing I think to point out is to become that interesting, genuine person. One, it takes a lot of introspection. Um, you have to examine parts of yourself that maybe you don't want to, right? We talked about people running around in a trance state earlier. Like you can't be doing that. Things have to be purposeful. You need to have ideas and sort of plans for what you want to do with your life. And even if you don't have the best plan right away, you need to have an idea of like, oh, I'll aim here. And then if you don't like that one, then you adjust a little bit and you like try again. Um, Couple more maybe quick hits type questions. You mentioned meeting with senators and other politicians and stuff. What's been kind of or who I guess has been the best experience, most open to not trying to be to say like other people are bad, but who have you met that's been like, oh, this person was awesome?
I would say two people. One is there's a congressman from Utah called John Curtis. Um, he won the primary in a Republican primary in Utah for the Senate. So he's like 99% likely to be the next senator from Utah, replacing Mitt Romney. Um, he's like one of the nicest, most genuine people that I've ever met in politics, and he came up with this idea for a conservative climate caucus. So fellow conservatives who also care about this issue to have a caucus in Congress. It has 85 Republicans in it in the House. The idea for that caucus came on a hike that I did with John Curtis in his district back in 2020 with one of my colleagues, actually the founder of ACC, Benji Backer. And we spent 6 hours hiking up this mountain together with John Curtis and back down and just talking through him. And he's like took half a day to talk to us about this stuff. And over the years, we've like developed a friendship and a relationship, and he's done things for us, and we've done things for him, and now he's headed to the Senate, and so like we've built that personal relationship, and he's just such a nice guy. And if I see him in the street, it'll like be like, "Hey, John, give me a hug," give him a hug, and just like that's just you've related on that personal level, and so he's an incredible person. And the other one is Reince Priebus. He was Trump's first chief of staff. He serves on our advisory board. He actually was the chairman of the convention, the Republican convention, a few months ago. Um, I was with him earlier this week. He's like also just one of those guys. He doesn't have to meet with me. He doesn't have to be on our advisory board. Like he was the president of America's chief of staff. Like he like can do whatever he wants to some extent, right? But he's very willing to meet and take time out of his day and be helpful where he can and include us in the convention and things like that. And so he's another one I would say has been really nice. And there's like a little bit of a cliche that people in politics are just all backstabbers and vipers and all that kind of stuff. And there's their fair share as well. But honestly, like a lot of people that I work with and have met and um, like talked to, are actually a lot of them are nice. And sometimes the political incentives are such that in some ways they can't be that way publicly or whatever. But often they're all real humans behind the masks, and it's good to get to know them.
Well, that's good to hear. I say that's promising. So I generally try to have an optimistic view, and stories like that always help for sure, knowing that the people that are in Washington, we'll say, generally care about what's going on. Um, Last kind of thoughts, or final topic. What are your thoughts on the election? We've seen some very interesting things, some near tragedies, and a few other oddball tidbits here and there. What are your thoughts on the election? I'm not gonna ask you to make a prediction because who knows. But
I'll make a
what are
prediction.
your Sure, go ahead. What are your
I'll
thoughts?
make a
Make a
prediction.
prediction. Do you think that we're done seeing crazy things?
No, that's the first prediction. The second prediction is I think Trump White House, Republican Senate, Democratic House. That's my prediction. Um, I think that it's going to be extraordinarily tight. I don't see really how Harris could win Pennsylvania, um, which I think is by far the most important swing state. I think she did very well in the debate. And it's kind of amazing to me that she's been able to moderate herself, or like appear to moderate herself to an extent where like half the country is like potentially willing to vote for her. Um, it's kind of like a crazy transformation over the last few months and years. But that's my prediction. I don't think, regardless of the result, I don't think any of it's going to help us much with our polarization and division in the country. I actually was, I don't know if you watched the VP debate, but I
Some of
actually
it,
thought
yeah. I
that
saw some clips.
yeah, it was like really quite civilized and cordial, and what you'd
Yeah.
want to see in a debate. Like multiple times they agreed, multiple times like Vance said something nice and was like, "Man, I'm sorry to hear that," or Walt said something nice, and like that's the kind of civility that we want to be able to return to, I would hope, but not necessarily optimistic about that in the short term.
Yeah, I'm hoping 2028 we'll have a new kind of crop of people, whether it's Vivek, Vance, Tulsi, some of these sorts of names will be the ones that we'll be seeing pop up in 28. And um I don't know. Like I said before, I try to be optimistic about it. And I think we have good reason to. I think the tides are turning in a lot of different directions for the better. You mentioned the same for nuclear and other things, but um I guess to wrap up, where, if the people are interested in going to find more about you or ACC or any other things that you're doing, where should they go?
Yeah, so our website is acc.eco, ECO, acc.eco. Our Twitter, I refuse to call it X, is ACC_national. My personal Twitter is Chris Barnard DL. Um, and so I'd say those are probably like the best ways to check us out. We're on Instagram as well, Facebook. And yeah, I think if you're someone who cares about kind of the outdoors, energy issues, any of that kind of stuff that haven't felt represented in the conversation because of kind of some of the craziness we've talked about in this conversation today, if you feel like you're kind of disenfranchised from that, but you still care, we might be the home for you. And we have opportunities to get involved. We do nearly 300 events across the country each year. We we help our volunteers write op-eds, letters to the editor, do fly-ins, go to our summit, meet with members of Congress, advocate for the principles that you believe in. Um, Whatever it might be, I think there's something to get involved with. And so feel free to reach out on our website or to me personally.
Very nice. Links, as always, will be in the description. Any last nickels before we get you out of here?
No, aren't I supposed to come up with some question for the next person, or do I not?
Offline,
I do
offline.
that
They
offline.
don't, yeah, they don't get to know.
They don't get to know. Okay.
Well, Chris, thank you for your time. Like you mentioned, and we're both very busy, so I'm glad we were able to finally find the time to sit down and chat. I think the work that you guys are doing is great, and yeah, appreciate your time and enjoyed the conversation for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric.
No problem. All right, guys, we'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening. Peace.